this history. And it's really looking at the Palestinian women and the type of anti-colonial resistance that they took, predominantly in the 1920s, specifically in the 1930s with the Arab Revolt, but even afterwards. And I really want to focus on both urban and Falah peasant women as well. And this is a beautiful photograph of some Falahi women on their way to the well to collect water. This was taken sometime late in the 1800s to the early 1900s near Safad, Palestine. And so I think one of the most fascinating things for me when I'm digging through old archives and I'm trying to understand Palestinian history through a decolonial lens and beyond the prism of these Orientalist sort of narrations that we've been indoctrinated with, essentially, is that in almost all the old archival pictures I find of Palestine, and there are so many, you find a Falah woman, right? She is somehow hidden in the backdrop of one of Palestine's city. On the left here, this is a photograph of Silwan. You know, they are collecting bushes for fuel, as in the middle picture, or on the third picture here to my right is a Palestinian girls' school in a village. And you know, this really reinforces this unique identity that I think indigenous Palestinian women have with the land. They're very much connected to the land, a part of the land, growing within the land. And I think that is reflective in the many cultural pieces that we have today. For example, Palestinian embroidery, right? The type of embroidery that Palestinian women created was specific to their region. It was specific to their landscape. And I think this is super crucial, really looking at this strong indigenous connection that particularly Palestinian Falah women had with the land. But even, you know, when we're thinking of Palestine and we're thinking of historic Palestine, we are often, you know, given this, you know, this sort of very subliminal idea that Palestine was this desert, and then the British arrived and they industrialized it and they modernized it. And that's actually very inaccurate. Palestine was a very booming country. It was a nation that was building. Women were prospering in this country as well, in this new, you know, in this nation post World War I, before that as well. And I think that gets lost in translation. And I think another facet of our history that gets really lost in translation is the level of anti-colonial resistance that existed. And I'm going to focus predominantly on one Palestinian female historian. I have her pictured here on the left. This is Nadia al-Mughanam. She was one of the first university-educated Palestinian women. She was a lawyer, but she was also a writer, and she gives us a really good glimpse into Palestine during the 1920s and during the Great Revolt. She writes this book called the Arab Woman and the Palestine Problem. And in this book, she details the role of Palestinian feminist activism. She details British policy. She details the levels of anti-colonial resistance that were existing well beyond Great Revolt. And one of my favorite pictures that the book is a demonstration here. That was pictured in 1819. And this is a bit after the US, I believe it was called the Crane Commission, that went into Jerusalem and different parts of Palestine and asked Palestinians, you know, where they would like to see their future. And, you know, a great majority of Palestinians supported this idea of Greater Syria, of uniting the Levant together. And, you know, we know through historical documentation and through the events that unfolded later on, that was sort of a fake vote, a sort of charade, if you will. And there was never any intention by imperial powers to actually allow these new nations to be self-governing or determine their own destinies. Rather, there was a destiny that was being laid out for them. And this is a demonstration again, and the banner reads that Palestine is part of Syria. And Matzi al-Ghanem goes into so much detail. She discusses the proposed constitution that was being built for Greater Syria and for Palestine with the different Arab congresses that were forming. She talks about sort of this energy, this thirst that was there amongst the people to build something, to create something, to have a democratic government where minority rights were protected, where different people could effectively live in peace and build in prosperity. And I think this is such a really, really important authentic perspective on this time period. That it, offers us so much insight, so much amazing and valuable insight, and a lot of the insight that I pull for the next portions of some of these images that I show you actually come from Matzi al-Ghanem. And one of the things that she discusses in her book, she spends a lot of time detailing Palestinian women. She talks about all the different charities and organizations that Palestinian women were involved in. And she gives us a really, really great image on what life was like in Palestine, right? During sort of the last phase of the Ottoman Empire and right at the beginning of the British colonial project. But she talks about a specific event, and this was the Burak Uprising of 1929. And she sees that as sort of the shifting event where Palestinian women were forced to come out and sort of organize in order to confront colonial abuses. And she discusses that this is when the first Arab Women's Congress was established. And over here, pictured to my right, is a photograph of the different sort of urban women that joined and created this Palestinian Women's Congress as a way to organize and express their grievances against what was happening during the Burak Uprising. And a lot of the details that she provides us discuss things like the arbitrary arrests, the collective punishments, any Palestinians suspected of participating in the revolt against the British. They were, imprisoned, sent to the executioner row, their homes were blown up. Their family was also forced to suffer as a result of this. And she talked about the mass sweeps of imprisonment that was taking place, right? British colonial forces would just go into cities, into villages, and just stage mass arrests of all the men in these villages, right? And, this is when women were forced to sort of confront this reality and do something about it, which is exactly what they did. And on the left here, I have a photograph of the first Arab women's demonstration in cars in Jerusalem. And this was done after the Arab Women's Congress met with the High Chancellor at the time to discuss their grievances, to complain about the brutality that was being enforced against the Palestinians during the Burak Uprising, the disparity, the way the Palestinians were exclusively blamed, exclusively singled out. And so forth. And, this is when we saw a significant shift, and we saw more accounts of women actually taking part in anti-colonial resistance on both fronts, on the urban as well as the more rural aspects as well. And, the Burak Uprising was very, very detrimental. It's a revolt we don't focus on so much. I don't think it had as big of an impact as the Great Revolt, but it was still a really, really important point in Palestinian history, because I think this is when we saw direct sort of confrontations with British colonial rule and effective declarations of anti-Zionism, no to Balfour, and so forth, right? On my left is a picture of British soldiers responding and beating people in the street during the Burak Uprising. On my right is a photograph of a general strike that took place throughout Palestine. And a lot of Palestinians rose black flags, symbolizing the Great Strike, and the flag reads, "Long live Palestine." Okay. And I think, what's truly profound about the first Arab Women's Congress is how in depth their work actually stems. I think, there are a few really great scholars that discuss the Arab Women's Congress in great depth, but I think if you read a lot of mainstream discussions on the first Arab Women's Congress, they're sort of sidelined as this, bourgeoisie sort of organization that was there and just simply organizing. And I don't think a lot of emphasis is placed on actually the amazing detailed work that they did. They wrote letters, they wrote memorandums, they addressed the League of Nations. And I actually have a copy here of, I got this off of the League of Nations archive files of a sort of memorandum that they sent to the League of Nations to complain and protest against British policy in Palestine, complaining about things like disparities in hiring, complaining about things like allowing immigrant Jews to possess arms while arresting and harassing any Palestinians who did, complaining about the incarceration rates of Palestinians, complaining about a myriad of different things. And one of the most interesting things that I found in Mathiel's work is her discussion about the colonial powers and the failure that Palestinian women faced in advancing more sort of feminist friendly policies in Palestine. And she argued that the biggest barrier to pursuing these policies, right? Policies like, eliminating, marriages for 14-year-olds, for example. She says it was actually the colonial power in charge, Great Britain, as opposed to the national population. And I think, again, this is something truly, truly profound that we really need to take into consideration when we assess the history of Palestine and the Arab world in general, is looking at that colonial influence and how that colonial influence really, really undermined a lot of these efforts. And I think it's also really, really important to note that at a time when, right, Western women were fighting for suffrage rights, fighting for recognition, Arab women were doing just the same, only they were fighting against a colonial entity, fighting against imperialism as well. And we, before the Great Revolt, you had a myriad of different protests, anti-colonial protests that took place in Palestine. This is another photograph from a demonstration that likely took place in 1932. As you can see, it's a women's protest with even small young girls protesting. The banner reads, "No dialogue or negotiations until termination of the mandate." Again, right, very forceful. We want to, declare national independence. We don't want to be colonized by Great Britain. We reject Zionism. We reject the partition plan. And I think it's really, really profound because women had a very, very direct role in, making this something at the forefront. When we get to the Great Revolt, I think this is where we see more sort of dominant, widespread, and active participation taking place by women, both urban and particularly Falah women in the rural areas. One of the things that I found interesting was that Mathiel Moughanem's book, The Arab Woman and the Palestine Problem, is actually dedicated to the Palestinian women who lost their lives during the revolt of 1936. And we'll talk more about Palestinian women in armed resistance, but I also really want to emphasize, and depicted here with the picture on the left, how brutal these British colonial policies were, and how the extreme measures of collective punishment, measures of blowing up homes entirely, measures of arresting every male within the family. And this caused extreme strife. And it's very interesting. I think, this is sort of a side note, but if we really look at the history of British colonialism in Palestine, we find identical scenarios taking place until this day, such as the forms of collective punishments that are still being enforced in Palestine today. And Falah women, right, women of rural Palestine, women from villages and so forth, were really, really essential in this revolt for a number of reasons. I think one is the fact that they took up arms during this resistance movement. A few urban women did as well, but a lot of Falah women did. There is one female Palestinian who we have a name of, Fatima Ghazal, who died during the Battle of Wadi Azon, but we know that there are many, many more women who took up arms and who actually fought British colonialism in this way. And I think one of the major distinctions that we see between Falah women and, sort of this more urban elite group of women is Falah women did not engage with the colonial entity. It was sort of this very, very stark line. They didn't have access to these resources. They weren't writing memorandums. They weren't, organizing meetings with the High Chancellor. This is definitely a very, very stark class disparity. And what we know about the Great Revolt is that it was, in essence, a peasant revolt, right? It was the revolt of the Fallahin, who were being very, very fundamentally impacted by British colonialism, by Zionism, with more settlements encroaching, with more land being taken from them. And Falah women, in this essence, really, and this is a point that I would argue really sustained the Great Revolt in such a deep way. Outside of taking arms, you had so much other work that was being done. This photograph that I have here on the left, this is a photograph of Palestinian women with baskets atop their head, and they are walking into Bab el-Habas, which was the prison of Jerusalem. And you have, ample documentation that women used to walk miles and miles and miles, right? Numbers that we can't fathom today or have the capacity to do. But they would do that, and they would visit these prisons. They would go feed the, men of their village, their relatives, and so forth. Women would go and cash in their dowries as a way to free the Palestinian prisoners during the Arab revolts. You have a lot of, different sorts of stories as well. I have the photograph of the women in Safad carrying the water bassinets on their head. And you have many, many different reports that discussed women on their way to the well, seeing British soldiers and ululating or so forth to warn nearby villages that, hey, the British presence is there. You have women who have died in these crossfires. And like I said, I think, going back to sort of this first statement that I made about Falah women really blending into any landscape photograph that you find of Palestine. They're there, right? They are working this land. They are walking miles and miles and miles every single day to get the water, to reap the harvest, to do to carry out their daily tasks upon this land. And this, I think, gave them a lot of different access and ways to participate effectively. Something else that they would do is, in Palestine, particularly in Fallahi culture, we have a lot of different songs and mutilations and so forth. And these are, chants that we do. We still do them till this day. And Palestinian women would actually relay political messages to Palestinian prisoners during the Great Revolt, and they would do so through code. They would add extra syllables to different sorts of songs and chants as a form of code, so that Palestinian prisoners can get the latest news, can know of an intended escape plan, and so forth. And in this sense, they were very, very active in this revolt. Another way in which they were active was through arms smuggling. During the Great Revolt, you had intensified security checks. Every single gate in Jerusalem, for example, anybody entering or exiting Jerusalem would be patted down for arms. You had random checks throughout different villages looking for arms, punishing Palestinians who would bring in arms. And this had been a policy that was in place for quite some time. I mentioned earlier that one of the complaints of the Arab Women's Congress was the fact that the British colonial forces would allow Jewish immigrants to smuggle in arms or have arms while punishing Palestinians for doing so. And this effectively intensified during the Great Revolt. And so women began to smuggle arms If they were wearing a veil, if they were wearing a thobe, they would smuggle these arms, they would be hiding arms. And this became a very, very serious issue. You have, different reports, for example, in the center. I thought this was a very, very interesting report. There is a Durzi woman, Hania bint Abu Ahmed of Lebanon, who was actually caught trying to smuggle in arms for the Palestinian resistance during the Great Revolt. You had ample reports of women throughout various cities in Palestine who were raising funds for the rebels as a means to supply them with arms and so forth. You have a lot of different reports of different women being arrested. On my right here, I have a photograph of Sidhaj Nassar, who is one of the greatest Palestinian feminist pioneers. She, alongside her husband, founded the very, very prominent Palestinian nationalist newspaper called Al-Carmel. As early as the 1920s, Sidhaj Nassar created a section specifically in Al-Carmel for women. It was called Safhat al-Nisa, where she would talk about different issues impacting women, encourage women to be anti-colonial, to boycott certain shops and so forth. And during the revolts, Sidhaj Nassar actually created a militant women's organization. And she was eventually arrested for smuggling arms and spent a year in prison. And British reports actually refer to her as a menace, as a sort of pain that they are unable to rid themselves of due to her fervent activism. So we have this ample documentation of so much with women in Palestine, with women during the Great Revolt. And I think we have to even, consider beyond the revolt what these things mean: resistance through culture, resistance through folklore, and so forth. I talked about women using their dowries as a means to pay for prison fees and so forth. And I think this is also truly essential after 1948. After 1948, when, half the Palestinian population was forced into exile, women again use their dowries, use their, we refer to it as a shitcha in my balad. It might be different for others, but this elaborate headpiece with the coins, right? Use their dowries to support their families, to help them get up. And even beyond that, one last thing that I would like to share with you is my aunt. I'm currently in a village called Dar Buan, which sits just on the outskirts of Ramallah. It's also very close to Jerusalem. And my aunt is a very real Fallahi woman. She never left the village. And she looks a lot like these women in these photographs. And I love talking with her and exchanging different stories. And oftentimes I actually show her these photographs and she explains to me in great detail what these women are doing. But we were talking about the 1967 war and the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. And I found it very interesting. She shared this story with me. She said that after 1967, when the Jordanians left and when Israel seized the lands, Israel did rounds to all of the villages in the West Bank, and they would stop at a village and they would basically tell them, surrender your arms now, or we are going to kind of shell the village, we are going to arrest the men, and so forth. And as we know, 1967 was a very, very dark moment in the history of Palestine, but throughout the entire Arab world, it was a very sort of defeatist mentality. And my aunt said that in our village, right, everybody sort of followed suit with the village over and just simply surrendered. There was one village, however, that is also near to ours. It's called Mukhmas, and they refused to surrender their arms. They actually ended up burying all of their weapons as opposed to surrendering them. And my aunt told me that, after, the war had ended and things had relatively calmed down, her and my late grandmother went to Mukhmas, this village, to pay respects to somebody that had passed away. And upon arrival, the women, the Fallahi women of Mukhmas, started chanting, يا خسارة يا دواونا يا مناح سلمتوا لليهود السلاح يا خسارة يا هدى بعد الجراءة سلمت البرودة, right? And this translates to, oh, shame, the people of Dibwan who are great, you surrendered your weapons. After your might, you essentially let the gun fall. And this what to me was a really, really remarkable story. Because I think, again, right, if we, one of the things I do is I read a lot of poetry. And if you read poetry that came from someone like Nassar in 1967, you saw the words of defeat, you saw how crushing the 1967 war was. And you still had these women that were like, why are you surrendering? How could you do this, right? These are Fallahi women, essentially taunting my aunt and my grandma, saying, how could you guys give up your weapons? And I think this is a lasting tradition that we have seen today. And what took place in Palestine, took place before, French Algeria and the Algerian Revolutionary War, but we see so many similarities with that in, women at the forefront, in indigenous people fighting and resisting against a force much stronger than their own. And I think when we reflect on Palestine entirely, we must put women at the forefront, particularly Fallahi women at this forefront. Nobody understood the land better than they did. Nobody, knew had a stronger relationship with this land than they did. And they have been and continue to be the fiercest fighters for Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Salam. That was amazing. Amazing presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Nadia now, who will be talking about a subsequent generation. You ended by talking about 1967. I think that ties in very nicely, or it segues very nicely into Nadia's presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Nadia.
Okay. Well, I
in the frame. What is this?
Excuse me?
Go ahead, Nadia. We'll mute the others.
While I set up my thing, let me just thank you. I want to thank the Palestinian Feminist Collective for inviting me to participate in this event, and especially Nairuz for being the one that reached out, and Maha for being the one who sort of organized the content of the event, and Salam for that amazing presentation. There's a lot there I didn't know, and so it's really thrilling to learn about your work. So what I'm going to do, I think you can see my screen, right? I've got several different pieces in different places, so hopefully I can get through this effectively. But what I want to do with my talk, it's going to be perhaps a little more informal, more perhaps of a conversation with Maha, is talk. So what Salam did, she recounted this quite amazing history and the ways in which photography documents so much of that history, and enriches the sort of written documents we have with the visual. And what I'm going to talk about talking about the long 1970s, the period of the basic, more or less, of the PLO in Beirut, stretching from well, I guess we could say Amman, Beirut, from the late 60s through the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. What I want to focus on is less images as documentation as much as a conscious effort to construct certain ideas through images. And I'm going to begin with what you see on this screen are three sort of iconic images of Palestinian women that come from film and photography from this period. But then I'll talk briefly about these three images and what they represent. And it's obviously only a very small slice of the larger image archive. And then I want to focus most of my comments on a film that was made by Muhammad Malas, Syrian filmmaker, at the end of this period, and the way in which he is reflecting on the Palestinian Revolution from outside, from a little bit of a distance geographically and also temporally, but very affectionately, and the ways in which these images end up being refracted and other kinds of truths emerging from this work. And that film is The Dream, Al-Manam. It was shot in the camps of the refugee camps of Beirut, mostly Burj al-Barajni camp in 1981 during the Israeli attack on Beirut, the Fakahani district, which is where the PLO had most of its offices. The filming was interrupted by the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the Sabra and Shatila massacre. And Malas only finished the film after the Camps War, which was a very brutal conflict in these same refugee camps. So he only finished the film in 1987 at the end of the Camps War. And that temporal distance is reflected in the film. So first about these three images, what we have are first, the first is from the 1973 film, Scenes from the Occupation of Gaza, about a woman whose home has been destroyed, who is protesting the destruction of her home. The second is from the film, the 1974 film, They Do Not Exist, which is about a woman who's just become homeless, and because her home has been destroyed in the Israeli attack on Nabatea camp in 1974. And she's bidding farewell to her son, who also died in that attack, from a street in the village of Nabatea. And you see her speaking to his photograph with her other children surrounded around her, and the microphone of the sound person from the filmmaking team in the image. And finally, of course, this is Layla Khaled, who is, the iconic Palestinian woman militant, very articulate spokesperson, very active in, women's issues, the women's movement, and also in women engaged in actual armed struggle, as is represented in this photo. So what we have in these three images are first, in the first one, the Palestinian woman who is tied to home, which is connected to being tied to the land, and the land as a home space. But this home that is repeatedly destroyed and repeatedly rebuilt. And that becomes part of the identity of the Palestinian woman in revolution. The second is the Palestinian woman who is the mother of fighters, but also the mother of martyrs. So there's this generation of the fighters who will keep the revolution going, but the woman who also has to repeatedly mourn the loss of the fighters. So there's a connection, obviously, between the first two images, and both the and these are women from, well, all of these are women from the camps, and perhaps in some ways, oftentimes a sort of a continuation of the fallahat, the women fallahin that Salam just talked about from the earlier period. And then with Layla Khaled, we have the liberated Palestinian woman. Oftentimes she's educated, although not always. She's usually secular, she's militant, she's articulate, And she is often, particularly in films, is kind of a spokesperson. And women like Leila Khaled appear in many solidarity activist films from the 1970s, as does Leila Khaled herself. From this period. So these are sort of three iconic images out of many others that exist from this period. Now, what I would like to do is to juxtapose these. So I'm going to leave my slideshow. Whoops. And I'm going to juxtapose these with Melis's film. And as I said, Melis, he's a Syrian, but deeply affected by the Palestinian experience himself. He lost his father, who fought in 1948 to the struggle for Palestine. He's from Quneitra, which was lost in 1967, and that became a theme in much of his later film work. And I would say that his making of this particular film is a continuation of that. But he wanted to do something, and he was invited by the PLO to make this film in 1981, but he wanted to do something a little bit different from what previous filmmakers had done, particularly after the PLO became embroiled in the Lebanese Civil War, and the experience and the ways in which that experience changed the Palestinian experience with the struggle. He struggled with what to do in making this film, how he could distinguish his film from the earlier material, and finally hit almost accidentally on this idea of filming camp residents as they recited to him their dreams, the actual dreams they had when they slept, and the ways in which the experience of being part of the revolution in various ways, as fighters, as or just as residents of the camp, affected, were refracted through the dreams. And he focuses on that, and I think a different kind of truth, a different kind of relationship to the revolution emerges from these stories, as we'll see in the film. Now, the film is not focused specifically on women, but there are many, many women in the film, and I'd like to show just a few clips and invite you all to think about these clips in relation to the three icons that I presented. The woman who's tied to home and land that's repeatedly lost, and she repeatedly rebuilds. The woman tied to as the mother of martyrs, and also continually losing her sons and reproducing martyrs, and the woman who is actively involved in the revolution. So I'm going to now switch to, if this all works, just sharing these clips. Okay. So, whoops, I'm sorry. Got it. Here. Okay. We can start with this one. And then I would just like to invite a conversation about this, these clips. Let me make sure that my sound is shared. Yes, okay.
حبيبي هذا سلاح حبيبي يا عيوني، هذا سلاح اللي اشتغله ابني بإيده، شايفينه شو هو؟ حديد، منه حديد، منه بقاوم كمان، منه كمان بيقتل العدو. نحن حاملينه ذكرى الشهيد الله يرحمه.
طيب كيف صار هذا السلاح؟
صار عملوا حديد عند الحداد، هو من 10-12 سنة قبل ما صارت الثورة. ما بدي اقول لك يعني قبل ما اجت الثورة على المخيمات، على البلاد اللي انتشأت الثورة، قبل ما انتشأت الهودي كان عم يشتغل فيه وهو بالمدرسة. ما كان عندنا فكرة بدها تصير ثورة وإشي، بس هو عقليته وهو ولد كان عم يشتغلوا. ما بعرف رحمة من الله اجته هيك انه في بدها تصير ثورة يحرر بلادهم اشي، واستشهد الله يرحمه.
بيشتغل هذا السلاح كيف بيشتغل؟
بيشتغل 7 ها بقوس 7 هيان طفل كيف بيحمى بالايد، انا قوست فيه بيحمى بالايد كمان.
Okay. Okay, let me get the next one.
نعم، أبوي بالسعودية بيشتغل معرض مفروشات، أمي بتروح عنده وبتيجي يعني كل فترة بتروح تقعد شهرين هناك وبترجع لهون. إحنا 4 بنات، أختي الكبيرة متجوزة جوزها بداس، هاي جزيرة بأبو ظبي. هالجزيرة فيها بترول ومصافي. هاي الجزيرة ما بدخلها إلا الرجال، ممنوع يعني النساء تدخل ولا بأي شكل. بيجوا يعني اللي بداس بيجوا كل 3 أشهر مرة بيطلعوا من الجزيرة، يعني بيطلعوا إجازات. أختي الثانية ازدهار متجوزة واحد من الضفة وهون ساكنة هون. أنا اشتغلت بالمقاومة فترة طويلة، بالعمل الاجتماعي والعمل السياسي، يعني كل العمل كل أشكاله. بكرة بدي أنزل على بيروت، بدي أجيب جواز سفر لأني مفكرة أسافر. يعني ليش بدي أسافر؟ مش يعني أهم شيء، المهم أسافر يعني.
Okay. So the next clip I'm going to show features 2 women who were in Tel Zatar camp when that camp fell in 1976. And just briefly, for anybody in the audience who doesn't know, this was at the beginning, relatively early in the Lebanese civil war. This was a refugee camp in East Beirut that was put under siege for more than 50 days. Many people lost their lives during the siege. And when they were able to finally negotiate a surrender of the camp and the removal of people, many people, and we don't know the exact numbers, were massacred as they left the camp. What's important about this, other than the fact that it's a horrific, traumatic event, is that it was intensively documented immediately after. It was, the news reports were during the siege were one thing, but then it was mainly the PDFLP that the DFLP that did intensive documentation of the camp. There were 7 films that were made. There were interviews that were collected and published with the survivors. And I would argue that a new appreciation of the role of Palestinian women as they were living the revolution on a daily basis emerged from the stories of Tel Zatar and the ways in which they were collected and disseminated. And this involved some of what we saw, in the clips I just showed and the previous images of loss and fighting, but also the actions of collecting. And this again connects with what Salam was talking about the earlier period, where a real valorization of the work of collecting water, of baking bread, of tending to the wounded, of managing, the movement from, one building, and then as that building became more dangerous, moving to another, feeding lentil water to babies because there was no milk, and that kind of thing. The setting up of homes in Dammur, all of that was documented and valorized as revolutionary work in the intensive work by many organizations, especially the DFLP, and then it becomes refracted in this segment of Malas's film.
وبعدين قال ما في شيء ابدا، لا في اكل ولا في شيء ابدا، كله مدمر. قال احنا عندنا بيت هيك خراب بالمره ما بيسواش هيك. عم اقول لامي طيب بدنا نولع الفنار، كيف بدنا نولع؟ ما فيش ضوء ولا في كهرباء ولا شيء. عم قالت لي شو بدي اعمل؟ قلت لها كاز ما في، مازوت ما في. قال بابا نايم جوا. ولا بقول لي شو اشبك؟ قلت له طيب ما بدنا كاس، كيف اروح اجيب من عندهم؟ قال لي لا ما تروحي، فاذا رحتي يمكن يذبحوكي، خليكي هون.
جوزي استشهد بالزعتر. كان بالاول يشتغل بطرمبة بنزين، وبعدين لحق العمل الفدائي لحد هاي الايام، من يوم إن صار العمل الفدائي وهو يشتغل فدائي، يروح على الارض المحتله. والله كان جريح بالزعتر واستشهد بالزعتر. بشرنا احنا طيب يعني. انا لمن ما طلعت ما مرقت عليه ولا شفته.
بعدين بعد ما فتشنا وخلصنا رجعت شفت ابوي بالمنام مرة تانية. قام قال لي سمعت شفت امك راحت على سوريا وبرمت، قولي لها حاجة تبرم. وبعدين قمت انا قلت له وين؟ طيب قلنا وين؟ قام قالنا مش عندي، لو عندي كنت انا قلت لكم انه عندي عشان اطمنكم، الله بيعلم. على كل حال اسالي واحد اسمه حنا الدحدولي يعني بهيك.
مش عندي وين يعني عنده؟
يعني بالاخر.
Okay. Maha, I have a couple more clips. Should I show them, or do we want to talk, or what would you prefer that I do at this point? Because it's...
Let's go ahead and turn to a discussion about it. I have lots of thoughts just with the rich clips that you've shared so far. One of the things that I was thinking about as you were sharing the clips, and actually as you were sharing you shared them with me a few days ago, and they've been sort of in my mind, kind of bouncing around, is thinking about this notion of legacy. So we saw Salam's presentation, particularly the role of Falahi women holding together communities, and then you have the women in these film clips holding down communities, even though they are in the shatat, in camps, and they're away from their homeland, and yet they're holding down communities. They have the sort of inner strength, I would say, that comes with being able to talk about the martyrdom of sons and fathers and husbands and brothers in that kind of matter-of-fact way as a part of the revolution, I think stems from that longer history that Salam was also sharing with us at the beginning of the hour. I was also thinking, sort of flashing forward to the present, thinking about women like Ibrahim Nabilsi's mother, Huda Jarrar. So for those of you who may not remember, Ibrahim Nabilsi from Nablus was martyred last year, and his mother became known in social media and sort of more broadly around the world for her, very similar to the first clip that you showed, the sort of pride in the ability for her son to be able to fight the Israeli colonialism and occupation with very rudimentary and sort of homegrown and homemade weaponry. That kind of a legacy I really see now really for a century. So the village next to Deir Dibouane that refused to hand over their weapons. From the 1930s also we have similar stories of Palestinians who refused to hand over their weapons to the British, and the British going and looking and searching very violently in villages looking for weapons. So this idea of the kind of homegrown internal strength that comes from being able to put together, as rudimentary as it might be, as basic as it might be, being able to put together something to fight against colonialism and occupation is something that is really striking to me. The other thing, and then after this, I think I want to open it up maybe to the audience as well. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. The other thing that I was thinking about in both of your presentations, actually, is what you call, Nadia, the valorization of women's work. This idea that things that are traditionally allocated to women's work, whether it's cooking, feeding, cleaning, transporting food, feeding babies, all those sorts of things, that in second wave feminist discourse was kind of dismissed or discounted as being sort of not real work, for these women across the century is seen as essential work, and not something that's relegated to women because it's inferior, but is something that women take up because of their centrality to the cause, but also because of the ways that they can evade surveillance. In both the 30s and the 60s and 70s, it's women who are able to evade colonial surveillance, and which allows them then to not only do the quote unquote women's work, but then also to transport weapons, to safeguard fighters, things like that. So the ways in which this work and the Palestinian revolutionary work, both the legacy of it and the continuation of it over this past century, and then also the ways that it challenges, I think, some Western notions of what it means to have women in revolutionary roles, that it's not just holding a weapon, although that sometimes is what it is, but that it can also be a myriad other roles as well. So yeah, fascinating. So thank you both very much for your presentations. Salam or Nadia, do you have anything you want to add before we turn to audience questions?
I'll say, I should have probably said this before I showed the clips so that you could have it in mind as you watch them. And by the way, the film is on YouTube, so you can watch the whole thing. It's a beautiful film if you're interested. But two things that I think are particularly striking about these, and actually a lot of the films that are made is the ways in which, for Malas, he's very careful about how he contextualizes women. And a lot of their lives can be, you can find out a lot about their lives from the backgrounds or the simple tasks he has them do. The one stirring, I believe that's a laundry, big laundry pot. So I found that very interesting, in that she's telling, in a nutshell, just in her family, all these women's experiences. The husband who's in the Gulf and she can't go, he comes once every 3 months. The one whose husband is in the West Bank and she's in the camp. She used to be in the revolution, but she's also doing laundry. She's, there's no separation between being in the military, being in the resistance, and doing laundry in the home. And she wants to leave. And, so just let's be frank, it's difficult. Or some of the beautifully kept but modest homes in the, people's kitchens in the backgrounds. This also is really important. So the actions that women are doing and the context in which they are placed and what that tells you about their lives.
Yes, thank you for that. Salam, do you have something you want to add?
I just, again, agreeing with everything that I'm hearing here, and also really appreciate that you mentioned Ibrahim al-Nablasi and his mother, right? And looking at the Palestinian woman as also, the mother of martyrs and so forth, right? The last thing Ibrahim Nablasi in his message to the Palestinians was, I love my mother, right? I love my mother. And now what you're seeing is this tradition, right? Where you have Palestinian women who bury their sons and they're zaghating as they're burying their sons, right? They're ululating as they're burying their sons. And I think, again, right, this really speaks to this strength, this dominant core that they have really taken upon themselves in the Palestinian struggle, as we will not be defeated. And I think it even goes back to kind of the story that I shared with that village of Mukhmas, right? At a time where everybody was like, 6 days and we lost essentially everything and everybody was defeated, the stance of these Fallahi women was, why did you bury them in the ground, right? Let them go rotten. Do not surrender your arms. And I think, right, whatever decade we're looking at that being reinforced, that resilience, that, you know, persistence to continue fighting, to hold on, to not be defeated, even as you are burying your son, right? That is really, really centralized at the core in Palestinian women.
Thank you for that, Salam. Are there questions among the audience members? We have a very robust group of participants today. We have 90 people participating today. Are there questions or comments for our speakers that you would like in the last few minutes of our gathering today? So I see a couple of hands. Let's start with Francis. Go ahead, Francis. You can go ahead and unmute and ask your question. Should I unmute you?
I think she disappeared.
Okay, we'll turn. I have Nadia next on my lineup. Nadia, do you have a question?
Not really a question, just a comment. I want to thank Salam and Nadia for this. Just listening to a lot of these stories here, I think it's really important that, within our own communities that we share a lot of these stories, because a lot of this, I didn't know, and I'm learning today. And, there are a lot of powerful stories. And I think that just is a testament to the power they actually deliver and what they have. A lot of them are not known. And we live in also a way to decolonize our mind. We live in a society where we value stuff off of capital output. You can't really measure this in terms of capital output, but there's extreme amounts of value in it. And so I think relaying these stories to our own communities just kind of empowers us, and also, promotes the message and to others that are just unfamiliar with our story. So, thank you to you both. And I think keep doing this work, because it's really informative and educative to me, and I'm sure others as well.
Thank you, Naji. Hassan, you have your hand up.
I love what y'all did so much as a Black man here in America, and having our story distorted about our groups that have been waging struggle from the beginning, to hear y'all talk about how the struggle was in the beginning, when people just thought that Palestinian women was just laying down and accepting it, and it ain't nothing like that. And for y'all to have the documentation and to bring it like y'all bring it, man, I got so much love, and it encourages me here, man. Thank y'all. Thank y'all. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Hassan.
Yeah.
Francis, you're back. What was your question or comment?
Yeah, I enjoyed both presentations. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. So my main thoughts after listening, and also listening to some of your comments, Maha, is that, Palestinian women, I think like all women who are nationally or colonially subordinated, all groups, they recognize that there are internal contradictions. I think that internal contradictions and external contradictions. I think sometimes the confusion is that, the confusion that some have with, women's resistance to colonization and imperialism and racism, and class. One of the internal contradictions, of course, is class inequality, but also patriarchy. And I think that's what I saw. I didn't see some kind of zero-sum way of thinking and living life in those. I love the clips So yeah, so I just wanted to raise that helps us politically and theoretically, analytically, empirically to think about the coexistence of internal and external contradictions, and that includes Nabulsi's mom, you know, so there and decisions that you make politically for the struggles you're going to fight and which spaces you're going to fight them in. Thank you.
Thank you, Frances. Bara'a, you have your hand up.
Can I just
Sorry,
comment? Yeah, just to Frances, I agree 100%, of course. And I think one of the important things that Meles manages to do in this film is to actually make that visible, make some of the contradictions, the internal contradictions visible. I don't know that he was thinking actually consciously about patriarchy necessarily. Probably not, but I've never asked him, so I couldn't say for sure. But I think he makes that visible if you look at the whole film. But also, it's a very complex treatment of this repeated loss that Palestinian women are shown, the way in which repeated loss is shown to be integral to the role to their role within the revolution, and that's a problem. Not a problem that he can solve, but a problem that he can make visible. I mean, there's real trauma here. There's not necessarily trauma in the individualized way that it's often talked about in the West, but there's real trauma. And that's part of where the refraction comes in.
Salam, did you want to add something? Okay. Bara'a, you have your hand up.
Oh, hi. I just wanted to say thank you for everything, specifically the clips. They were very eye-opening for me, and it really showed me that martyrs are never just numbers. As a 22-year-old young lady, I've lived in Palestine my whole life. I always heard about history, but I've never felt disconnected to what happened. And I wish more people knew about this, specifically my age, the younger generations. They had golden era bet on them that they will forget, but truly I'm so grateful for all the clips and all the hard work you put in this, because it was really eye-opening and I feel so connected, and I feel like this message can be held now and I can just express it clearly and express it truly with my entire feelings from the depth of my heart. So thank you so much, guys.
Thank you for that. Nancy.
Thank you. Yes, I also want to thank you for this presentation and the opportunity for us to come together and learn. I sometimes it's just, I don't even know how to express my dismay at how poorly understood the struggle of Palestinian people against Zionism is in this country. I live in the US, and we are bombarded with negative propaganda against Palestine, and it's an issue that a lot of people who maybe have the power to make some changes or sometimes even express fear to raise the question, because it can be the end of a political career. Not that I rely on politicians to make change, but it's very important that we do things like this to humanize Palestinian people. And I think that was the beauty of the film. There's no opportunities that are lost in this corporate press here in the US to humanize maybe people in Ukraine. But when it comes to other people in the world, people who have faced, decades of colonization, of settler colonization, of neocolonialism, you don't hear those stories, and these people are not treated like human beings. So thank you for your efforts. I'm wondering what connections your organization makes with other organizations of other peoples and other parts of the world that are essentially facing the same thing, but just, a different colonizer maybe in a different colony. So to what degree are you working with other people outside of the Palestinian community? And thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. I think this will be a great time for me to plug the work that Palestinian Feminist Collective does. I'm going to put in the chat there our social media handles. And you'll find more information with a lot of the co-sponsorships that we work on and also the other activities that we have. And so they are, Palestinian Feminist Collective is a very intersectionally oriented organization. And it's also very much attuned to the work of other third world feminists and other marginalized peoples and peoples of color, not only in the US and on Turtle Island, but around the world. So I'd invite you to take a look at our social media handles for that, and also to take a look at some of the other history of the other individuals who we didn't talk about today, but who are very much part of our work. We highlight Palestinian feminist figures, both historically and contemporarily, on a regular basis. So you can check some of those out on our social media handles as well. Let me turn now to Anna, who's had her hand up.
Hi, everyone. I'm joining in from Jojage, Montreal, and I want to say thank you so much for that really brilliant contribution from both of you, Nadia and Salam. It's more of an observation rather than a question, you know, as each of you sort of have brought in archival material and really made the connections to thinking about the gendered labor of both like keeping on storying, like the story keeping that's there, but also continuing to hold a particular fight. It made me really think about like erasure and like sort of obscuring of women's work in the context of the American Indian movement, thinking about Gana Satage, and like oftentimes Gana Satage, for those who might not be familiar, is the Oka crisis in the 1990s in the context of Jojage. And a lot of times the hyperemphasis is on a masculinist narrative. And I think what both of you have done so beautifully and rather critically is thinking about that the like women's contributions to that particular form of story. That's our baby cat. To holding the line in a very specific way that oftentimes aren't part of the historical spaces and the stories that we oftentimes inherit. And I was just really thinking about those sort of like parallel narratives, because you have ongoing occupation in so many different geographies happening at the exact same time. And while both the examples I bring in are obviously post-1960s, but really like what both of your conversations strung together so importantly is that invisible or that sort of obscured story that's so necessary to have a better understanding of what has continued to happen. And then the important work that's constantly being done to bring in a different sort of perspective and lens of that labor that's just not really front and center a lot of times. So just a general, just thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Elaine, you have your hand up.
This has been a excellent educational experience. I am, striving to learn, as others have said, about Arab feminisms and understanding. I can understand it a little more in connection with indigenous feminisms within the US, and that it is collective and not individualized as typical white kind of dominated feminism here is. It's vitally important to have these stories, and this body of evidence is wonderful. In the context of Palestine today and how Israel and with the world's complicity seems to be, really trying to put the nail in the coffin. This is a truly existential threat, and something I've perceived, but maybe is not correct, is that there is an adherence to conservatism and kind of patriarchal kind of systems in being in solidarity with the Palestinian sovereignty and liberation cause. And but I'm not hearing the voices of the leadership from women. I know I followed Hanana Shrawi forever and just really hung on her authority because there was no other woman that was being heard. And I wonder what you're seeing today, or maybe I'm probably missing those voices or not going to the right sources.
Thank you for that. Salam or Nadia, did you want to jump in here?
I mean, I think if you are looking at any mainstream source, the only Palestinian voice that you are going to hear reignited is one that is of a more sort of liberal Western orientation. I think if you really want to, there's so many different Palestinian organizations, so many different Palestinian female prisoners, but their names are not as widespread, and that is because they don't engage with any form of normalization or with any form of the sort of liberal Western sort of neutrality standpoints. And, you know, this is not to single out anybody on the dominant sphere. There's a lot of really good, amazing activists on the dominant sphere that are speaking, that are doing wonderful work. But actually, this even relates to a question that I saw in the chat by Iman. And one of the questions she asked is, why do you think we don't know so much about the Fallahin women? Why do we have so much more documentation about other women, right? And I think the obvious answer is there's a big difference between an elite, university educated, well-off Palestinian woman living in Haifa, living in Jaffa, living in, you know, whatever village girl who likely has no access to education and has a much different life in terms of resources. But, you know, that's part of the answer. But the other part of the answer is usually when you go to places like Jenin, usually when you go to these villages, there is no policy, there is nothing. We do not engage with this entity, right? We resist, we remain indigenous, and we remain ourselves. And I think this is, you know, one of the reasons why we don't have so much documentation perhaps on Fallahi women, because we do know that they were, you know, they really, really fought against British colonialism. We have different telegrams that, you know, British officers would send saying these women are attacking us, you know, at Jaffa Gate or what have you. But it's this sort of dismissive attitude that they had towards them because they were so indigenous, because they did not try to appeal to any Western authority. They didn't try to blend in with the new industrial Western world, right? They wore their traditional clothes, they spoke their mother tongue, and they presented themselves in a very, very indigenous light and had a strict policy of no engagement. I don't know if you have watched the great documentary on Netflix called Farha, but, you know, one of my favorite things about that documentary was the opening scene of Farha throwing a rock at the tanks. And I think that is, you know, effectively representative of a lot of the Palestinian women today fighting against the ongoing, right, colonial project that we have been combating for more than a century now. So I hope that hopefully answers some of your questions.
Thank you for that. And thank you for your question, Elaine. And I think that is a great way to sort of wrap up our discussion. And so Francis, did you want to add? No. So I think that's a great way to wrap up our discussion. I wanted to, again, thank Salam and Nadia for joining us, and to thank all of you for joining us on a Saturday, either morning, afternoon, or evening. All of them are greatly welcome. I want to thank also the Palestinian Feminist Collective organizers, Lubna and Abir and others who are behind the scenes making this event happen. And stay tuned for more information. Please follow our social media handles. Stay tuned for subsequent discussions. We have them every month in alignment with our Feminist Future calendars. And follow Feminist Futures, follow Palestinian Feminist Collective for more information as well. So thank you all. يعطيكم العافية. شكرا.